Okay, we will go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Hannah Chapman, for those of you who do not know me. I am the Theodora Romanoff Assistant Professor of Russian Studies and Assistant Professor of International and Area Studies here at the University of Oklahoma. And on behalf of the Department for International and Area Studies and the Romanoff Center for Russian Studies, I am very pleased today to introduce Dr. Jade McGlynn, who is going to be speaking with us today on the topic of Russian memory politics abroad, war, restraint, and diplomacy. A very timely topic as we approach the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion in Ukraine in about 2 weeks' time. So Dr. McGlynn is a specialist in Russian media, memory, and foreign policy, and is based at the Department of War Studies in King's College, London. Prior to her current appointment, Dr. McGlynn taught Russian literature at the University of Oxford, where she also gained her PhD. She is the author of 2 forthcoming books, Russia's War and Memory Makers, and is the editor of 2 volumes on memory and periodization. She is also a very frequent contributor to public discourse and has been featured in a number of very prominent outlets, including things like Foreign Policy, the BBC, and others. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. McGlynn, who's going to talk for about 45 minutes or so before we'll have the chance to have a Q&A. So if at any point during this presentation or afterwards you have a question that you would like to ask to Dr. McGlynn, please just click on the Q&A button and enter your question there, and I will then have the opportunity to ask that to Dr. McGlynn. Okay, so with that, let me turn it over. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chapman, Hannah, and thank you to everybody. Today's presentation is going to be about Russian uses of memory abroad. I'm going to talk about sort of the different categories, the different ways that they approach this, drawing on examples, of course, from within Russia, but also from around the world. And because if we want to make sense of Russian memory politics abroad, we're going to have to first ground that in how Russian memory politics works at home. And so the structure of my talk is broadly as follows. Going to look at first at sort of how the past is policed at home, and then we're going to look at what history is used by the Kremlin, what are the sort of core myths, and then we're going to look at memory diplomacy, which is how Russia tries to use its history as a form, or Russian officials try to use their history as a form of soft power to bolster their influence and relations. And then the opposite of memory diplomacy, in some ways, memory wars, where it has these sort of battles over what really happened, who really started World War II, often with Poland and the Baltic states and of course, Ukraine. And then finally, we're going to look at a concept called memory restraint, which I'll explain in a bit more detail when we get to it. And then the extent to which memory politics and memory in history can be universalizable in terms of the history, or more likely in terms of the tactics. So without much further ado, here we are. Historical memory is the most important component of our culture and history. Our present and our future will be made with reference to these historical experiences. And this man, I think, sadly needs no introductions, Vladimir Putin, and he was speaking here in 2014 at Saliger, which is a sort of youth conference around a lake, and sort of young people, and we will discuss what's the meaning of Russianness, what's the meaning of being a patriot, etc., etc. And the reason why I've chosen this quotation is because it really just emphasizes the importance of memory, which I think perhaps, at least until last year, seemed like a rather esoteric point of focus, but it isn't. I think the last decade of Russian domestic and foreign policy are incomprehensible without dwelling for a rather long time on the rewriting and the uses of history to legitimize and justify the Kremlin's policies. This isn't just top-down, of course. The blurring of historical fact with partly remembered fictions, as in any country, has long since become a normal part of Russian politics and its obsession with the past. It's as if sort of the Russian government has been trying to recruit the Russian population, like understudies in a play an already completed play of historical fiction centered on the Second World War, but encompassing different storylines, rewritten and woven together by the Kremlin, politicians, media, civil society, and also the many ordinary Russians who've chosen to sit down and stay watching and get involved in their own ways. And this official but also societal obsession with sanitizing history, with making it make sense, molding it into something usable, it's fueled ultimately, as in any country, by an insecurity, but perhaps an insecurity underscored in Russia, born of the changing ideological regimes, the senselessness of the historical traumas Russia experienced in the 20th century. And the power of these cultural memories is, of course, immense. And the Kremlin has wielded this power to prepare its nation, to prepare its people for the situation we're in today, for the war and for repressions. And so, whilst this has been Kremlin-led, it's also worth noting that ordinary people have taken part in this immersive conflation of past with present, and that's covered quite a vast, sometimes quite a bizarre range of activities. So I think there's lots of pictures of children driving around in tanks, World War II tanks. I haven't included those pictures because I always think it's a bit unfair on the children who perhaps may not want those images shared or didn't choose to have those images taken. You could also celebrate your child's birthday party at a fairground partisan village, for example, in Patriot Park, just outside Moscow. Or you can clamber aboard the Echelon of Victory train museum, and this I do have a photo of. I see it here, so we won or we were victorious is written on the side. And this was a train that's chugged across Russia and Belarus in 2018, laden with wartime exhibitions, propaganda posters, and of course, anti-aircraft guns. So that weird mix of the terrifying and the trivial, as well as the solemn. But as well as providing this fodder for bemusing headlines, the politics of memory sits at the very core of the Russian political system, at least since 2020, when the new legislative amendments that essentially amounted to a new Russian constitution codified the duty to defend historical truth and protect the memory of the Great Patriotic War, Russia's term for the Soviet Union's war against Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front from 1941 to 1945. And in this memory and law, there's little space for the darker chapters of Russian or Soviet history, of the Red Army's mass rapes in Berlin, or the post-1945 Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe. And such restrictive legislation did not come out of the blue. The Russian government, media, and to some extent even public had been laying the groundwork for it far in advance. And the government's intensive use and propagation of often selective interpretations of history has been part of an effort to not only legitimize itself, but also to define what it means to be Russian and to project power at home and abroad. And here perhaps add a quick sort of personal note, which is that my interest in this topic, that's just the uses of history, as I would call it now, emerged when I lived in Russia for the second time from 2011 to 2015. And I was following the Euromaidan protests in Ukraine in 2013. And I was watching, of course, the BBC, like any good Brit, but I was also watching, since I lived in Russia, the sort of nominal equivalent. I certainly wouldn't compare them. Russia Один, Russia One. And I wasn't really shocked in the difference in interpretation, but I was quite sort of bemused really and curious about the intensity and the selectivity of Russian politicians and domestic media's references to history. And also, you know, this comparison of the protesters to Nazi collaborators and the real detail that they went into about the Second World War as experienced in Ukraine. And one of the things I noted as well was it just seemed to me to be incredibly effective. I mean, this was rather anecdotal at the time. Since then, I've read different sort of studies, and they show that using this type of analogy consistently is incredibly effective in terms of foreign policy recommendations and foreign policy positions. So they did it in the US, for example. There was a Stanford study, and they, there's a sort of made-up war a smaller country against a larger country, and it's whether or not the US should get involved. And they gave one group references that framed it very much within the Vietnam War, with lots of comparisons to the Vietnam War. And they gave another an article that very much framed this conflict within World War II, this idea of, oh no, it's small democracy against tyranny. And it led to completely different recommendations from the audiences. So this isn't something specific to Russians, but I think it was the intensity, and I was very much fascinated by the way that this technique, which I've come to call historical framing, combined and demanded, but also distorted knowledge of history, of political culture, of communications, of nationalism. If bluntly, it just seemed like there was an awful lot going on. But mostly it was about how this type of framing, this type of intensive use of analogies made history relevant to people who were watching right now or right then, by pretending that these desperate traumas or euphoric triumphs from the past were being repeated right now in real time, and you had your chance almost to take part in them. And the more I researched historical framing, the more I researched its uses, the more apparent it became that this invocation of history wasn't just about this particular policy. It wasn't just about what was happening in Ukraine, though what was happening in Ukraine was very central to it. But it was also about imposing a revised understanding of what it means to be a patriot, or even what it means to be Russian. And I've included here a quotation that I found very useful in helping to understand this process and why it worked, I suppose, which is from a scholar at Princeton, Sergei Ushakin, and it says, in Russia, effective belonging today is produced through the repetition and or reenactment of the past. And I think I've always understood this to mean that the way that the media, the way that the television and politicians presented it, I think with this intensive use of analogy, it allowed people to feel like they were really taking part, maybe even reconstructing heroic episodes from the past. It linked them to a long line. It gave them that sense of that they were repeating, to use a quote that will be familiar to Russia, to scholars of Russia. To look into this, obviously, I didn't just sort of sit there. I went and I did a lot of interviews with people in the province, in the so-called regions, so essentially not in Moscow or Petersburg, though I did do some interviews in Moscow as well. And to look at, I did interviews with people who were organizing like patriotic history clubs and camps and festivals, particularly those aimed at the youth, but not only. And the more I did, the more it became clear that this discursive preoccupation of history is transmitted from elite circles, but not solely derived from them. And I think there's a Russian scholar, Vladimir Malakhov, who argued that the government's turn to history as a form of political legitimation, it came partly in response to what they saw as a general public appetite for a narrative that cast Russian identity and history as worthy of pride. And this common interest then sort of allowed the Kremlin's politicized historical narrative not only to take root, but also to transcend some of the traditional confines for discussing history. Now, before we go too much further, I'll just briefly point out that it's important to differentiate between history, so events as they happened, and or an evidence-based presentation of the historical events concerned with how they happened, and memory, so the recollections and representations of lived experiences, especially because the Russian government and state-aligned media deliberately blur this distinction, sort of passing as history what's in fact memory. And they use veteran stories, historical reenactment, and we see a historical reenactment here with this. We see some soldiers dressed up as well. Sorry, some men dressed up as World War II soldiers, and then we see a random guy in what looks like a cage with a dog, and it says sort of fascism into the dustbin of history, and they're sort of recreating a POW, or sort of the capture of a Nazi soldier. But these types of reenactments and the constant war analogies that we've discussed, they imbue some of the narratives with a sense of authenticity, of communicative memory. So that sense that the history is still alive. And the pretense that historical narrative is actually a real memory or an unchanging essence has also reinforced the argument that, which has been implicit to the Kremlin's uses of history, that espousing the correct memory is a core attribute of Russian identity. So if you possess the correct historical crib sheet, then you also will get the master key to decoding current events. So very basically, you have to understand the past in order to understand the present, but very large. But then I think it's also important to understand, okay, well, what's on this crib sheet and how to interpret it correctly. So what history is used. And the important thing, one of the more important things here is the sharpness of the language in Russia at times around history actually conceals the amorphousness of the approach to history. So it builds on popular narratives of history and then diverts these narratives to its own needs. And the Russian government and the state-aligned media have tried to weave these popular and sometimes mutually exclusive narratives together to build as large a constituency as possible for approved memories. So in a speech and in popular culture, it's quite normal to see praise for the imperial Tsarist tradition in the same breath as praise for Brezhnev era or a reference to medieval knights. And this hodgepodge or melange, depending on how posh we want to be, reflects the mosaic nature of the Kremlin's approved cultural memory, but also the eclecticism of this usable past. And it speaks to a political flexibility as well, which is born of the need to deconstruct a workable post-Soviet identity that in some way responds to the legacy of the USSR, but eschews the Marxist ideology that came with it. And so I would argue that the Kremlin's vague, highly adaptable historical narratives are about creating a coherent Russian identity, but out of what, when you look at it, is really quite an incoherent past. And every nation has to do this. Every nation has to connect. So it's dead and it's living and it's unborn to an imaginary community to create that sort of master commemorative narrative where there's a basic storyline that provides the group members, the members of the nation, with a general notion of their shared past. And in any country, the actual events as they happened generally matter that pretty well, very little, provided that they can be interpreted in such a way as to support the core cultural constructs that are needed to underpin, to unify, to legitimize. And through its use of history, I'd say the pro-Kremlin master commemorative narrative supports three broad arguments. So one, that Russia needs a strong state. Two, that Russia has a special path of development. And three, that Russia is this messianic great power with something unique to offer the world. Now, whether the celebration of the state in question relates to Stalin or Alexander III is much less important than that the state being celebrated is evidently strong. That said, Vladimir Putin and his senior ministers have generally tried to avoid divisive issues, which isn't to say that sources are or were condemnatory of, say, a figure like Stalin, rather the opposite, but just that they tend to avoid mentioning him unless needed or unless they're quite certain that's going to work in their favor. Instead, politicians and the media generally, they invoke and promote quite a Soviet-focused historical narrative, but it is one that's focused on creating this sense that there's 1,000 years of history. If we look more specifically, the triumphant events of this narrative include sort of the Great Patriotic War, obviously, it's the real backbone of the Kremlin's turn to history, the legacy of Kiev and Rus, the notion of Prince Volodymyr or Vladimir as the founder of all Rus, from which all three Eastern Slavic nations are, in this view, in the Russian view, supposedly descended. Alexander Nevsky's military victories over German and Swedish armies, Peter the Great's triumphs against Sweden, imperial territorial expansion as seen under Catherine the Great into Ukraine and Belarus, or what we call today Ukraine and Belarus, victory in the First Great Patriotic War over Napoleon, successes of the Cold War like the space race and Soviet superpower status, and the somewhat imagined stability of the Brezhnev and Andropov eras. And these are all events that showcase the benefits of a strong state, point to a special Russian development, and demonstrate the country's right to great power status. Tragic or traumatic events are, on the other hand, invoked as warnings, and they include the time of troubles, a period of political crisis at the turn of the 17th century following the death of Fyodor I, which led to anarchy and occupation by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the 1917 February and October revolutions, Vladimir Lenin's nationalities policy, which gave further autonomy to Ukraine and has been a topic that Vladimir Putin mentioned in his Eve of War speech last year, Gorbachev's reforms and the Soviet collapse, and the anarchy of the transition to capitalism and the wild 1990s. And these events are all cited as evidence and examples of the negative effects of a weak state, or of a Russia attempting to follow or having imposed upon it a foreign path of development. And the Putin-era tendency to recode vague memories of the USSR into Russian patriotism as part of a highly selective and broadly conceived legacy of the past also functions to create this sense of continuity that I mentioned earlier. The Russian government sought to impose this constructed consistency onto Russia's unruly and discontinuous history, most famously in Putin's repeated insistences that Russia is a state with 1,000 years of history. The use of history to provide a full sense of security relies on two components: the intertwining of mutually exclusive memories and the failure to closely examine the historical evidence for such memories. After all, this is not about accurately reproducing a historical era, but about indulging nostalgia and creating a worldview that promotes qualities amenable to those in power: a strong state, Russia's special path, and great power, messianism. But beyond this unsettled hinterland, there's another pillar of nostalgia. There's a specific pillar of nostalgia, that occupies a special role in some ways above all the rest. And that's, of course, the triumph of the Great Patriotic War. So as opposed to the international conflict of the Second World War from 1939 to 1945, or Вторая мировая война, the Great Patriotic War is from 1941 to 1945, Великая Отечественная война, and it's viewed as a war for and of the homeland against Nazi invaders. And much of today's war myth in Putin's Russia is indebted to the Brezhnev era's sort of neo-Stalinist war cult, which saw the construction of gargantuan memorial complexes all around the country and the introduction of new rituals for remembering the sacrifices of the veterans. These Soviet-indebted narratives focus on the great victory and very rarely on the 27 million Soviet lives lost, except insofar as those lives earned the Soviet Union a seat at the superpowers table. Russian identity and the state's moral purpose, if we can put it that way, are borrowed directly from the great victory of 1945, exemplifying how memory politics belongs to this larger symbolic discourse on Russia's place in the world and what it means to be Russian. As the successor state to the USSR, Russia's great power status is partly dependent on the legacy of the great victory. Its sacrifice and moral triumph over Nazism constitute both a justification and a motivation for Russia to pursue its ambitions. Consequently, any challenges to Russia's status as victor and liberator in the Second World War, through memory wars or through contestations of Russia's view of the past, could potentially damage its geopolitical ambitions and sense of identity. This fragility has led to what Russian sociologist Yelena Rozhdestvenskaya calls the hyper-exploitation of the past victory of 1945, which involves the constant making present of the war experience. And here I've included a picture of some little vodka bottles dressed up in St. George's ribbons. And these ribbons are used to denote, they've been used since 2005 to denote sort of respect and memory, respect for the memory of the Great Patriotic War. They also, around 2014, were sometimes used to denote support for the separatists as well. So they're not, they have many connotations. It's not always that clear which war they're a symbol of. But in any case, I think the fact that somebody's gone around and wrapped up the vodka bottles in these ribbons sort of exemplifies what Yelena was talking about in terms of the constant making present. So, I mean, in terms, as I've sort of mentioned there as well, Russia, this ribbon has sometimes been used as a symbol of support for the so-called separatists, for the Russian proxies in eastern Ukraine since 2014. And the invasion of Ukraine, both now and since 2014, has been depicted as a rerun of the Great Patriotic War. And this, if we look at sort of why history is being used to these ends of national formation, perhaps it isn't all that surprising, because this obsession with controlling memory, it both facilitates, but is also facilitated by the lie that Russian history is static and immutable, and anybody's history is static and immutable, and therefore contains within it a Russian identity that is also static and immutable. So rather than seeing the nation as something created and evolving around shared bonds, instead there's a vision of Russian history that it's not there only to cohere the nation, but it's also evidence of a coherent nation. So the way in which history is described makes it clear that there's a Russian way to remember and there's a non-Russian way to remember the past. And if you remember it incorrectly, that's not so much a difference of opinion, but an existential attack on Russian culture. Now, that's just if you remember it incorrectly. Of course, I've already spoken about the fact that they are able to cohere what would on paper look like mutually exclusive memories, but there are certain things that lie beyond that, in particular the Great Patriotic War. And any sort of attempt to undermine that narrative is seen as an attempt to undermine historic Russia, or the sort of the very primordial essence from which Russia's existence springs. And it's this essence that establishes Russia's right to behave as this great power. Now, interestingly, I would argue that without Ukraine, this essence evaporates. Russia is not a great power if it can't control its smaller neighbor. It's not a strong state if it can't conquer cities 40 kilometers from its border. It has no civilizational legacy without the inheritance of Kiev and Rus, and it's not worthy of its mission if it can't convince even Russian speakers to join it in cultural communion. And that's why we've heard such historically laden speech. Well, that's one of the reasons why. But in particular, I'm thinking about a quote, a declaration that Putin made when he began the attacks on civilian infrastructure in October last year in Ukraine, where he argued that Russia is fighting for its historical future. And to me, that summed up that Ukraine really is the essence in Russia's, or at least in Putin's, essentialism. In this view, if Ukrainians don't understand that they are Russians, then they need to be re-educated. It's because they've been brainwashed by the West or by Nazis, or take your pick. But again, in this logic, now proper patriotic Russians could help them. They have an access to this enriched understanding of the world, a special awareness or consciousness of their own history that imbues them with a privileged knowledge of truth, of how the world works. And this notion that Russians are especially informed and aware of their own history furthers the Kremlin's ability to appeal to different ideologies, because bluntly, who doesn't want to belong to a group with a special awareness of historical truth? But also this idea that Russians have this special awareness of culture and history, it's a means, it offers a sense of purpose. So if the unifying narrative of history answers the question of why Russians belong together as a nation, then the argument that Russians possess this unique cultural or historical consciousness answers the questions of why Russia is special, what purpose it fulfills as a nation, and why it has a right to dictate to, even control other countries. And the Kremlin's efforts to design this image and to convince people to engage with history, to make history genuinely something every day that people are engaging with, and to encourage physical manifestations of it, sometimes in the face of objective reality and sometimes not. They've been a defining feature of domestic politics since 2012 at least, but also increasingly of foreign policy too. And I'd like to spend the last 10 minutes or so just speaking about how these policies are translated into the outside world. So if we I mean, exporting memory and history can be tricky. Not everybody sees history in the same way, often in the same household, let alone across countries. And I think particularly if you're a country with as long a history of empire and wars as Russia, then you can't just use the same narratives at home as abroad. In researching Russian uses of history as part of its public diplomacy and or foreign policy, most scholars have focused on the invocation of the past as a soft power tool among so-called compatriots in the former Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact countries. And as we see in Ukraine, Russians make very little effort to engage with local histories or views there. They simply try to impose the Russian view. And the image here in the picture is a particularly dark one. It's of the huge St. George's ribbon that the occupying Russian forces forced the shell-shocked residents of Mariupol to hold out for Victory Day. As such, there are significant and meaningful differences in Russia's practices of public diplomacy, depending on the extent to which it shares or believes it shares or does not share a common historical experience with the partner country. A useful way to visualize these connections is to employ the metaphor of memory circuits developed by Rana Mitter to describe how regional and national histories, specifically of World War II, function across time and space. So, for example, Mitter examines how shifts in the way that Chinese official memory depicts World War II have been driven by a heightened political desire for reunification with Taiwan. Mitter also notes the interaction between Chinese circuits of memory and those of other countries, paying special attention to China's inability to create a memory alliance between its memory of World War II with the Western European version of World War II as a struggle of liberty against fascism, which has undermined the authorities' ability to bolster Chinese soft power. Russian officials have voiced similar exasperation to the Chinese, and this has helped them to add a spur or a branch connecting the two circuits, if we continue Mitter's metaphor. So if we see memory diplomacy as an act of co-construction and or adaptation of circuits of memory, we need also to remember that memory diplomacy is a form of public diplomacy. So this is where states or political groups try to improve relations and reputations by exporting commemorative practices and historical narratives, but also by allying their own historical narratives and those of another country. So here we see the Immortal Regiment, which is a march to remember those who contributed to the Soviet war effort. And this is taking place in Rome. And we also see there's a few other flags there, including one relating to Donbass. So again, we see this conflation of the Great Patriotic War and events in Ukraine prior to the 24th of February last year. So unlike memory wars, which focus on criticizing alternative views of history, memory diplomacy is more about promoting Russia's view, about creating memory allies rather than enemies. Of course, this isn't a Russian invention, but it's a tool that the Kremlin uses quite well across a wide range of tactics. And we've seen different state actors develop a wide array of commemorative symbols, activities, and core historical narratives for international use. So, such as, of course, the Immortal Regiment that we see before us, but also military history tours across Europe, historical camps for children, commemorative dance competitions. There's a waltz for victory competition that takes place in Austria and Germany, museum exhibitions. And these are all, well, the events that I'm looking at generally are organized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, by embassies, by official cultural centers and government organized groups. If prior to 2015, Russian memory diplomacy efforts largely focused on the Russian diaspora and former Soviet Union, then since 2015, there is a much larger shift in terms of funds and efforts and prominence to look beyond that space. So, for example, we see things like the Volunteers of Victory, who've been active in more than 90 countries, including the USA, where they distributed some 15,000 St. George's ribbons alongside brochures telling the Russian version of both this symbol and the Soviet role in World War II. embassy staff in particular tend to target groups believed to be sympathetic. There are cases in the UK where they targeted members of a group within the sort of a party within the British Labour Party that was very left-wing, more aligned with Jeremy Corbyn, who was then leader, and they were photographed wearing the ribbons and even shared images on their social media pages depicting the ribbons draped around a gun or a cannon. But the Volunteers of Victory, they promote this as a sort of anti-fascist or pro-Russian. They promote the anti-fascist or pro-Russian connotations, but of course they don't necessarily mention those linked to what was then the conflict in Ukraine, and now is of course a full-blown war. But it does show, this in itself shows how the Russian state actors can use the memory of the Second World War abroad as at home as sometimes as a bit of a Trojan horse to smuggle in other more contentious geopolitical stances. So I'm a bit aware of time, so I have lots and lots of quite odd examples here, but you'll have to use your imagination to work out what they are, or you can just ask me during the question time. But broadly, Russia uses different narratives that appeal to different parts. So obviously in Germany, then you can't really use World War II for pretty obvious reasons. So there, what they try to appeal to is a sense of sort of nostalgia, this sort of nostalgia for the East German, and they sort of promote this revisionist narrative that depicts the East German state in very rosy hues and plays on the disappointments and trials that followed German reunification, and sort of fuels this sense of nostalgia for a lost way of life. And then if we get to Serbia, then of course they promote the idea of, they very much dwell on the trauma of the NATO bombings and Russian support for Serbia in the Kosovo conflict and in earlier conflicts as well, for example, World War I. When we get to Africa, then they very much promote, understandably, Soviet support for Africa, for African countries in sort of colonialist, in anti-colonialist wars of independence. So in this sense as well, we can understand memory diplomacies, particularly in the latter case, as a sort of like a front or an alliance in a memory war as well. And these many of the people with against whom sort of Russia wages or engages in memory wars, this tends to be a prominent feature of Russia's relations with the former Soviet and Warsaw Pact member states. So we can think of the Russian government's disputes with Poland's Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2019 over who started World War II, or the Kremlin's threats to begin legal proceedings against the Czech Republic following the decision of the Prague authorities to move a statue of Soviet war hero Marshal Konyev, who was also involved in the Prague Spring, which is why they wanted to move him. We can see him there with the scaffolding. He's since been removed. Others, such as Nikolai Kutuzov, have examined memory wars across Europe and looked at the role played by memory laws, so laws about what is or is not acceptable to say in terms of in relation to the past, that provoke these conflicts. And of course, memory diplomacy is informed by these tensions, and as noted, can even constitute an effort to construct a memory alliance against those who would falsify history. But if memory wars is ultimately about contesting the past or somebody else's vision of the past. And I think it's not really a surprise, at least for Europe, that World War II memories lie at the heart of many of these wars, particularly since they lie at the heart of national and regional identities and render them very convenient instruments for mobilizing political and national sentiments. And they also sort of consolidate memory regimes or sort of political regimes based on specific narratives about World War II and its consequences. And Putin in particular wrote this 2020 essay on the causes of the Second World War for the American publication National Interest, and that in itself was just a thinly veiled effort to spark memory wars. So if memory diplomacy is about joining circuits and memory wars is an effort to sort of blow up or sabotage the circuits that Rana speaks about, then we have one final action, which is memory restraint. And that's, I suppose, about preventing the overloading or preventing the tripping of the fuse. And memory restraint is performed primarily on the state or the official level. And it's by its nature, it sort of involves a country restraining certain political habits with the aim of preserving or pursuing good relations. So some Russian scholars in particular, though not only Russian, for example, though he is Russian, Alexei Miller has argued that the nationalization has argued that Russia's kind of quite intense and politicized use of history and memory was spurred by what he calls the nationalization of Baltic and Eastern European memory politics. So that's what militarized Russian official politics of memory. However, although Russia is very sensitive to anything that they might construe as disrespect towards the war memory in the Baltic states or in Ukraine or in Poland, they're very happy to turn a blind eye. In other countries, for example, in India last year, Narendra Modi unveiled a statue to Subhash Chandra Bose, a Nazi war collaborator who forged alliances with Germany and Japan during World War II as he sought to overthrow the colonial British regime in India. Modi called the statue a boost to modern, independent, and confident India. Now, Bose was very similar to Stepan Bandera, a Ukrainian nationalist whose followers forged alliances with Nazis at points during World War II in order to fight for Ukrainian independence against Soviet colonial power. But if Bandera has spurred a million slurs, then the Kremlin had absolutely nothing to say about India's case, displaying admirable restraint. So we see that, of course, there's agency here, and that in foreign policy, as in domestic policy, these uses of history are subsumed within or subjugated to what we might call illiberal priorities or illiberal values. And if efforts are made to tailor and universalize Russian history to different audiences, then the liberal views that they underpin, they'll be much easier to universalize, if on occasion the history isn't. Now, just as I wrap up as a final comment, I appreciate that, of course, I'm here to talk about Russia, and clearly I've done that. But I think one of the questions that I always get is, okay, but this isn't unique to Russia. So everybody uses rubbish history, right? And I just want to kind of, I suppose, anticipate that by saying yes, completely, 100%. I think that in much of the secular world, particularly in Europe, I would say that history has even sort of taken on some of the parabolic roles of religion in explaining morality and good and evil. And I think that in general, we've obviously moved away from the age of ideology, which in itself was at one point a replacement for religion, to an age of memory. And we're seeing this around the world. We're seeing it in China, where there's a real focus on national humiliation as a way of kind of rallying the population against foreign imperialist bullying. And we've seen it, of course, in the Yugoslav wars, where they were very much framed within World War II. At home, for me, in Britain, the idea of sort of Britain stands alone in the cultural memory of the Blitz and the Battle of Britain as evidence of the UK's ability to succeed alone was very much used and invoked, during the Brexit referendum and in discussions of the EU. And of course, I know in America there are arguments and history and sort of memory wars being waged over issues such as the Confederacy or Columbus Day that ultimately all come down to sort of who belongs or what it means to be a fully fledged American. And as elsewhere, we see, as in Russia, we see history rendered a symbol of people's politics and worldview, but also of their identity and belonging. And I think that the invocation of history and the intense political use of the past that we see in Russia, they're consequences of and a contributing factor to politics and societies in which history and identity play an ever more prominent role, but also are ever more closely intertwined. And to that extent, I think that it's useful to study the Russian case because of its intensive nature, because this is a scale, exists everywhere. Of course, Russia is much more intense along the scale, but um, the it's not uniquely pathological. I would also add as a final point that further impetus to this is added by Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine, which I understand at least partly as a test of the Kremlin's historical propaganda and its ability to export abroad its vision, that it has this supposed historical truth and can bring it to others. And Russia's invasion failed on coming into contact with real Ukrainians, as opposed to those that it had constructed in the leaders' mythomaniac minds. But none of that, sadly, should distract from the continuing appeal of historical narcissism and myth making around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. McGlynn. This was absolutely fascinating. As a reminder, if you have a question for Dr. McGlynn, just please go ahead at the bottom of your screen and click on the Q&A button. You can go ahead and type your question there into that chat, and then I will ask it. So please use that function for our Q&A. So to get us started, this is something you spoke about already in your presentation, but I would love if you could expand on this a little bit. Does the use of memory politics as justification for Russia's war in Ukraine? So I'm thinking a lot about the essay that Putin penned back in 2021 about the historical unity of Russia and Ukraine, and the speech that he gave just a couple of days before the invasion on February 21st, that kind of rehashed a lot of these ideas about how Russia and Ukraine are one people and one country, and how this gives, a justification for Russia being involved in their domestic affairs. So could you speak just a little bit about how this historical memory has been used in the war?
Mm-hmm. In the full-scale war since the 24th of February. Mm-hmm. Yes. I suppose even in saying that, it's very difficult to separate the way that historical memory has been used since the 24th of February last year from how it has been used since at least the 22nd of February 2014, and this idea that Ukrainians, that essentially what happened in 2014 was an illegitimate coup and so-called Banderovцы, which in the Russian use of the term just means Nazi collaborators, have taken power in Ukraine, and they've brought Nazism back to life. Alongside this, of course, history is not the reason that Putin has invaded. It's the need to control Ukraine, the need to prove Russian sort of great power status. But all of that is informed by understandings of history. And I think I spoke about it in the presentation, this idea that really Russia's own identity, the way that Putin defines Russia's identity as a nation, it can't really exist if it doesn't have control over Ukraine. Of course, that doesn't mean the total violent subjugation of Ukraine, such as we are seeing. It could just mean like a subservient state, or a state that they can ultimately control, such as was the case under Yanukovych and under some others. But for various reasons, it becomes clear that Putin had realized that was not possible. Some point during the pandemic, that it was no longer possible. With the failure of negotiation, well, I don't want to get into too many areas that are outside in case I say something untoward, since it's being recorded, and I'm getting tired as it's getting later in the UK, and language is very important. But there were other reasons, but I think the historical interpretations, they underpin it. So it's not so much that the invasion of Ukraine and what's happening is unthinkable without the use of history, so much as it's incomprehensible without these uses of history.
Awesome. And so within Russia, particularly, how effective do you think the use of memory tactics has been in getting ordinary Russians to support the war in Ukraine?
So I think that the use of memory more broadly has been very successful, because it's something that the Kremlin has not imposed. It's very much been bottom up, and then the Kremlin has appropriated it. for its own ends. And we see this in particular of the Immortal Regiment, just as a good case study, where I showed pictures where that was set up by some independent journalists from Tomsk. And then in 2015, the government did a bit of a mix of a hostile takeover and a cloning operation where they set up their own and then bullied everybody into joining theirs, except for in a few cities. So now you have two Immortal Regiment organizations. But if you speak to most Russians, then they will say, oh, well, look at the Immortal Regiment. We set that up. That's just a citizen-led thing. They have no idea about the takeover. And I remember trying to explain it to somebody once, and they looked at me like I was insane. Because this actually happened. This is a thing that happened. But in any case, so I think that's one element. In terms of its usefulness in supporting the war, I think the important thing to remember about Russian support for the war is that it isn't really support. I mean, of course, you have these mad, of course, you have these mad people who, genuinely do want to go and fight and whatnot, and, want to commit genocide and obviously terrible human beings, but then really not representative. To be honest with you, sadly, in the same way that the liberal opposition is really not representative of the broader mass of society, I think what you get is much more a kind of a passive, either who knows what's going on, who knows what the truth is, or it's fine, I don't really agree with this, but it's my country, I don't have another one, my country, right or wrong, or even, well, they shouldn't have brought Nazis into power, where some of the narratives have got through. So it's not necessarily that they're terrible people who want to bring suffering to Ukrainians. It's just that that they believe at least some of the propaganda and genuinely think that they are saving Ukrainians, which in some ways is, it doesn't come from a bad place, even if the consequences are terrible things. But I mean, the Kremlin in general doesn't want active support, because that's quite hard. Because if you have people who actually believe in it, right, then they might start doing this, or they might start getting annoyed. And you do see that with some of the ultra nationalists, where they get annoyed and they say, well, you're not doing the war, as you should do, otherwise we'd be winning. And those people are hard to control. So it's much better to have people who are sort of, yeah, sure, do what you want, I'm with you. They're much easier people. And I think that's where the broad mass, for different reasons, that's where the broad mass of Russian support for the war is.
Yeah. So we have a related question that gets at the potential for narrative fatigue. So Markin, in her 1990 book on the rise and fall of Russia's cult of the Great Patriotic War, argued that the push on the war was so relentless that many Russians, particularly younger Russians, became quite weary of the narrative and even became cynical about it. So do you think that such narrative fatigue could also happen today?
I definitely think it could. And it's funny because I think about that a lot, where she describes sort of young people who are just really not bothered, and, these veterans come to speak to them. And I think, yeah, it's quite a vivid description in Nina Tamarkin's book. So yes, I think there is the potential for that. I would say that I think I wrote a chapter on this about how the Kremlin has tried to make its victory cult or its war cult much more engaging in that sense. So, and that's, I kind of hinted at it briefly with the discussions of the reenactment and the clubs and the camps. But, you have these things like these tours, and children win spaces on them. And then they go around and they go on a bus. Sometimes they even stay overnight. And, they have a little passport where they get stamps of the different war sites that they've been to. When they get to the war sites, they, dress up. And of course, we also, there are just so many different things, in particular, the activities of the Russian Military Historical Society and the Russian Historical Society, which again, people tend to think are actually kind of civil society organizations rather than completely sort of government organizations. But they've created things that are genuinely, really engaging, to a point where even if some of the actual history isn't engaging people, because they aren't afforded that much agency to criticize it or question it or go out on their own, I think that the fact that so many young people now have these events in their life that are focused around remembering history will ironically kind of become unifying in itself, a bit like having a prom or a vypustny ball, where, okay, yeah, do you remember when you were 12 and you had to go to military history camp and, dress up as the Red Army in the Leningrad battle, or whatever. I think that in its way will become a unifying experience.
That's really fascinating. So, kind of to get us back on Ukraine, because we do have so many questions regarding this. Uh, Here's a question that may be impossible in some ways to answer, but I do think is perhaps worth raising, which is that Russia has used memories of their past victories in history to create links with other countries on the world stage. How could you envision the current conflict being remembered and used in Russian memory politics in the future?
That's a great question. One of the things that I'm thinking, I mean, this is a bit of a sideways way of getting at the question. One of the things I'm thinking about now is just what, I mean, it's not really my place to think about it. It's just an intellectual exercise, but is what history Russia could use to create sort of, I suppose, what I would say is a more positive vision of its past, to then inform its identity. But even still, it's very hard. I mean, it's very hard to see how you can get anything positive from this war for Russia because it's in no way winnable because they're fighting an idea, and I mean, all of the options, all of the potential options available are bad in general, but they are especially bad for Russia. I think there's so yeah. Either it can be remembered increasingly as a sort of we can go more and more down this road that already exists, sort of increasingly paranoid. This is the moment when Russia tried to kind of fight back against all of these alien hostile foreign influences and to save Ukraine, and it only managed to save a couple of areas, but still then it's shut off from the world, and traitors undermined it, and it can go further that way, and unfortunately that probably is more likely. I suppose the other option is that it becomes like the option I would love to see, that what happens in Ukraine becomes like this lesson and a kind of a spur to sort of reimagining what Russian identity could be, founded around like a wonderful culture of dissent, and art and all of these things, but feels a bit idealistic.
Yeah. So you spoke about how Russia tries to make, positive visions of history, it uses nostalgia and Russia's special mission in the world, its history of greatness and its victories, and creating its historical memory. But do you see the opposite as well? So do you see, for example, the use of the fear of the past, of its failures, Russia's failures in the past, as a way to, create its present identity and also to influence how Russians see both their government and their place in the world?
Yes, 100%. So really is the sort of triumph and tragedy or triumph and trauma of the two elements against which the national identity is constructed. So very much the times of troubles, which refers not only to the time of trouble in the 17th century when there was the short occupation by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, celebrated on November 4th, or well, getting rid of the occupation is celebrated, the occupation is celebrated on 4th November. And I always found that really odd when I first arrived. I was like, oh, what holiday is it? And people said, oh, it's when Poland occupied us. And I thought, okay, it's not the way around I normally hear it, but in any case, it plays its role. And then other times of troubles, as they're now called. So the sort of the 1917 and the revolutions and the Civil War. And Putin had a very interesting interview in 2012, the sort of the famous one with Niezavissima Gazeta, where he talks about Russian identity. And there's this wonderful quote in it where he says, the wounds of the Civil War still haven't healed. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. But this is a country that needs very careful, sort of cultural therapy to deal with its history and its memory. And then after then we have, and then he declares 2012 the year of history, But yeah, the 90s in particular, I think, is the big one for obvious reasons. The trauma of the 1990s, this idea that, the Kremlin's been excellent, especially considering how many people in the Kremlin were involved in making that period quite so traumatic for people. And in fact, some of the leaders of the Donbass now were the local representatives of the MMM pyramid scheme. So that obviously robbed millions of Russians of their life savings and represented probably the very worst of what was admittedly a very terrible time for many ordinary people. But he's been very good at kind of conflating the personal humiliations that people felt of not getting paid, or getting paid in gherkins or some sort of awfulness, with the geopolitical humiliations on the world stage. And that's been obviously very powerful and very resonant, but it's also helped to distract from people actually thinking, oh, but who did rob? Where did all of that money go? Oh, oh, look where it went.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the 1990s because that's often one of the things that comes directly to mind when we think about revising history for their own purposes. So I'm wondering, have you seen over the now 23 years of Putinism a shift in either how memory politics is used or even the objects of memory politics?
Yes, and I think it's still shifting all the time as well. So in particular, there are certain memories that used to be not usable that now are. For example, Chernobyl, which they somehow managed to turn into there was an American Secret Service guy running around the nuclear power plant in Kiev, and it was outside Kiev, and now and basically he's to blame for it. And this is all just the people just saying horrible things about Russia and trying to tarnish the Soviet Union and Russia. And then of course Afghanistan, which in particular since 2021 and the chaotic evacuation, that's taken on even a new lease of life. But since 2018, they've been trying to recast that as actually, not a complete shambles, but a successful war. And that's been easier to do comparatively, for obvious reasons, comparatively since 2021. So we do see things shifting and them trying to bring more and more history into the narrative. I mean, a lot of it sort of swings and roundabouts. Like there's been a kind of another restoration of sort of Ivan Grozny as a nice guy. I was watching a documentary the other day. Ivan Grozny, not only did he not kill his son, he was actually a very pious, religious family man. He was just a bit of a patriarch, which seems a bit of a stretch. But so yes, we do see them changing. And I mean, even Putin himself, of course, like referring, in the early years, he very much saw himself as a Pyotr Stolypin type of person. And then, whereas later, now it's sort of, we hear of the Kremlin surrounded by busts of emperors and whatnot. So I think it has changed a lot. And I think one element as well that's kind of difficult is now that we have this full-blown historical obsession, it's quite easy to want to go back into sort of 2001, 2002, 2003 and say, oh, it was there. It was all there already. But again, I think that's where the scale is useful, because obviously there were elements of it that were there from the very start. But it's a question of scale. It's really a question of scale. I mean, this didn't happen because of the 2005 Victory Day celebrations. This was quite a deliberate effort at sort of making history really part of the everyday fabric of Russian life.
And so you spoke about this briefly earlier, but I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more of who do you think is really the target of a lot of these like memory efforts? Like, do you see particular groups in Russian society that are more or less likely to buy into these narratives?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So very broadly, they're quite clearly not targeted at the metropolitan elites. Or not elites, because they're not in a very elite position. Sorry, that's unhelpful language. Sort of the very well-educated, westernized liberals, sort of intellectuals. Obviously not targeted at them. I don't think really much targeted at them apart from repression. What they speak to is a sort of general sort of Soviet nostalgia. So what I was explaining was that a lot of these clubs, they existed anyway because people just created them on the basis, the teachers just created them as something for the kids to do on the basis of what they did when they were, in their youth. And then what happened is sort of after 2015, 2016, the state patriotic program of education and other sort of bodies in the presidential administration sort of come along and they start funding them. And then you have the Russian Military Historical Society goes federal. So it's there in all of the oblasts, in all of the regions, sorry. And so it also starts funding and taking over different things, or at least directing it, giving people manuals. So it's really much more sort of appropriation slowly, or even sometimes guidance. And sometimes, quite often, that guidance is very welcome. Sometimes it's not. And, they're not idiots. They understand that they're kind of the state are completely using the memory of the war for political purposes. And most people really don't like it, actually. It rubs them up the wrong way. But from the same point, they think, well, they're giving me money to do something that I think is a good thing. So there's a sort of combination of interests. But I think it's targeted at a mass audience. Obviously, it's not targeted at you know the sort of people who used to be academics at Wishka, or but it's I have to say, actually, I mean, I spent a lot of time in a couple of regional universities, and similar things that there was some resonance there.
Yeah. So I'm wondering so you spoke quite a bit about how these different objects of memory politics related to, say, the former Soviet states and the former communist states, how Russia and the Kremlin is using this. But I was wondering if we see instances of memory politics being used by other former Soviet states for like alternative purposes. So, for example, using memory diplomacy to distance countries like Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania from Soviet history and ideas, and establishing their own unique views of history.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, probably the most obvious uses of memory diplomacy right now are from Zelensky, who's just been wonderful at it. He comes to Britain and they've got these pictures of, Londoners during the Blitz in the underground, and, Kievans in the underground, now, and sort of references to Churchill and Blitz spirit. And, it really worked. It really, really worked on, British people love a World War II reference. Similarly, he went to Germany, and he spoke about how Germany used to be this dividing point between sort of the free world and the unfree world, and that was the role that Ukraine was now playing. And I think he went to America and also brought up Churchill and this sort of idea of and also Pearl Harbor, and sort of 9/11. He brought up 9/11. That was it. Brought up 9/11 as an attack. So he's very good at sort of tailoring his speeches, and a lot of that has relied on what we could call memory diplomacy. So that's kind of trying to create an alliance for your audience.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. Like Ukraine and Zelensky has been an excellent example of this. Are there others that you've seen that have been able, perhaps maybe not to use it quite as successfully as Zelensky has, but who have also attempted to, combat Russian memory diplomacy efforts in their own countries?
I see. Oh, I see. In terms of combating it. Well, I think Poland has, I mean, in some ways I sort of understand the whole central versus eastern, it's probably the broader regional effort to do this. In terms of in their own countries, I mean, that's probably slightly different, because really what you see in countries such as the Baltic states is them appealing. I mean, there's really two different memory circuits there going on, because often the Russian narratives there are aimed not at ethnic Balts, but at ethnic Russians who share the same kind of understandings of World War II as Russians, or at least that's what the media producers believe, as opposed to the Balts who have a very different version. And I mean, I think there's been some really good work that's happened there in terms of Estonia in particular, sort of working hard with the population of Narva to kind of make these pasts less contentious. But I think that's not really the same, probably, as memory diplomacy, or it would probably be more. I suppose it would be more memory wars, but it's more complicated, I think, when you have a sort of a Russian minority within your country than like as Estonia does, than say for Britain to turn around and say, oh, that's like nonsense, whatever you're saying, because we just have our own different kind of circuit, despite the fact that actually it fits very well with Russia's.
So I think, unfortunately, we have so many questions left. I feel like we could really keep this conversation going for quite a while, but I know that you both, it's getting very late there, and we are just about reaching the end of our time. Do you have any last words for us before we let you go?
No, that's quite a lot. No, I think actually I do have just one final thought, which is that I've spoken a lot here about uses of history as something quite negative, but I don't think they have to be. And in fact, I think that often they are quite demagogic. We do see demagogues use it, but in a way, I think that it's important for the non-demagogues to learn how to use this language as well, because it's powerful and there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with looking to history or having the odd, harmless myth, provided it doesn't hurt people, to make people feel part of a group. And I think acknowledging that power and maybe learning to harness it a bit, it shouldn't just be left to the demagogues.
Well, I think that is a perfect way to end this webinar. Thank you very much, Dr. McGlynn, for this really fascinating talk and our conversation. We appreciate you taking your time to meet with us today, and have a great evening. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the great questions. Thank you for the invitation. Goodbye, good night, good afternoon.
Goodbye, everyone.